The final point of today's agenda. It's an exchange of views with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights from the UN on the human rights situation in Kashmir. So before we begin, I would just like to remind you that a few days back, in the road leading to Jambul, to another major city, there was a terrorist attack where 40 police officers lost their lives, Indian police officers. I'm reminding you of this, and we will be issuing a statement to condemn this and express our solidarity with the victims. We firmly condemn all acts of violence. That goes without saying. At this juncture, I should point out that Kashmir is between three countries, and for 70 years it's been at the heart of a complex and 70-year dispute. Today's discussion will home in on the human rights situation of those living in Kashmir. Over the past years and months, our subcommittee has addressed a broad range of human rights situations, some of them more complex than others. We strongly believe in the importance of human rights and in the need to raise human rights issues without being subject to taboos. It is always when rights and freedoms are at risk that it's important to address infringements and to highlight the rights of those who are suffering from restrictions and attacks. Failing to address human rights violations brings frustrations, anger, tensions, and instability. The only sustainable security is that based on full respect of all human rights. When fundamental freedoms and access to justice inter alia are guaranteed, it is then that our societies are really strong, protected and secure. For the European Parliament, no cause can be justified by violence, and we will always condemn this violence. What's more, we believe in the importance of dialogue among nations as the most effective means to tackle problems. I am very glad that the UN Officer of the High Commissioner on Human Rights, represented by Christine Chung, is present here on the podium. She will share with us the main findings and recommendations of the OHCHR report on the human rights situation in Kashmir. The report was published in June 2018, and you will find it in your meeting pack. That being said, without further ado, over to Ms. Christine Chung.
Thank you. My attendance today before the Subcommittee on Human Rights of the European Parliament is in my capacity as a Human Rights Officer of the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. I am here to provide an informal, unsworn oral briefing to the Subcommittee on the topic of the human rights situation in Kashmir, and nothing in my remarks should be understood to be a waiver, express or implied, of the privileges and immunities of the United Nations under the 1946 Convention on the Privileges and Immunities of the United Nations. I would like to thank the European Parliament Subcommittee on Human Rights for the invitation to the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR, to brief you on the United Nations first report on the situation of human rights in Kashmir that was released on the 14th of June 2018. Let me begin by expressing on behalf of OHCHR our deepest condolences to the families of those who lost their lives in the car bomb attack in Pulwama district last Thursday. We are extremely saddened by these deaths and remain concerned about the large number of injured. We condemn the actions of those responsible for these killings and call for them to be brought to justice. The report seeks to draw attention to the human rights dimensions of a decades-long conflict in the disputed territory of Kashmir. The political dimensions of the dispute between India and Pakistan have been clear and center stage. Pakistan and India have fought two major wars in the past over Kashmir. The international community, as well as the United Nations, have remained hinged onto the political sensitivities of this protracted conflict. However, the violations and abuses of international human rights and violations of international humanitarian law that have been occurring in the Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir since the 1980s have received insufficient attention. Millions of people in Kashmir have been denied their basic human rights. OHCHR believes that any resolution of the political situation in Kashmir must entail a commitment to end the cycles of violence and ensure accountability for past and current violations and abuses by all parties and provide redress for victims. The report highlights a situation of impunity for violations committed by Indian security forces. It also covers structural issues in Pakistan-administered Kashmir that have led to restrictions on the freedom of expression and opinion and freedom of assembly and association, and of freedom of religion or belief. The report addresses human rights abuses by armed groups in Indian-administered Kashmir that include kidnappings, killings, and sexual violence, and it covers the consequences of firing and shelling across the line of control by both India and Pakistan. Finally, the report provides detailed recommendations to the governments of India and Pakistan, as well as to the Human Rights Council. Today, I will provide a brief summary of the key findings of the report. And before I do that, just a word on our methodology. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights repeatedly made requests to both India and Pakistan since the summer of 2016 for unconditional access to both sides of the line of control. This request has been repeatedly denied. As lack of access cannot obstruct our duty to promote and protect human rights, OHCHR undertook remote monitoring to produce the report. This is based on the mandate of the High Commissioner for Human Rights as provided by the UN General Assembly Resolution 48-141. The mandate of the High Commissioner includes the full range of activities aimed at the promotion and protection of human rights, including monitoring and reporting. The report relies on open source information, particularly parliamentary questions, court rulings, police reports, statements made by officials, and documents obtained by various parties in India through the right to information. And wherever possible, OHCHR has sought corroboration from national and international civil society organizations and human rights defenders on the ground. OHCHR bases its methodology using a reasonable grounds standard of proof. In assessing the situation of human rights in Kashmir, OHCHR relied chiefly on the binding legal obligations that both India and Pakistan voluntarily assumed as state parties to the various international human rights treaties, including the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, as well as customary international law. While the report focuses on events from July 2016 to April 2018, when large and unprecedented demonstrations were triggered by the killing of Burhan Wani, the surge of violence and subsequent human rights violations that started in the summer of 2016 has deep roots which required exploration and explanation in the report. Key findings include Indian security forces used excessive force that led to unlawful killings and a very high number of injuries. Civil society estimates that up to 145 civilians were killed by the security forces between July 2016 and the end of March 2018, with up to 20 other civilians killed by armed groups in that same period. The government's own figures have varied. Initially, the state government said 78 people, including 2 police officers, were killed in the 2016 unrest, but later said 51 people were killed and 9,042 people were injured between the 8th of July 2016 and 27th of February 2017. One of the most dangerous weapons used against protesters in 2016 was the pellet-firing shotgun. That is a 12-gauge pump-action shotgun that fires metal pellets. According to official figures, 17 people were injured or were killed by shotgun pellets between July 2016 and August 2017, and 6,221 people were injured by metal pellets between 2016 and March 2017. Civil society organizations believe that many of the injured have been partially or completely blinded. Impunity for human rights violations and lack of access to justice are key human rights challenges in the state of Jammu and Kashmir. The Armed Forces Jammu and Kashmir Special Powers Act 1990 gives security forces virtual immunity against prosecution for any human rights violation, including unlawful killing, torture, and detention. Under this law, the state government of Jammu and Kashmir needs prior approval from the central government to prosecute a soldier accused of human rights violations. The central government has never given such approval, while the state government has sent at least 50 requests to prosecute security forces personnel. Administrative detention appears to be used by Jammu and Kashmir authorities to circumvent the protections of ordinary criminal procedure. The Jammu and Kashmir Public Safety Act 1978 authorizes the authorities to impose an administrative detention order for a broad range of activities that are vaguely defined and allows for detention without charge or trial for up to 2 years in some cases. There is almost total impunity for enforced or involuntary disappearances, with little movement towards credibly investigating complaints, including into alleged sites of mass graves in the Kashmir Valley and Jammu region. Freedom of expression has been restricted as authorities responded with suspension of mobile networks and the internet for long periods in 2016, intimidation of the media, and targeting of human rights defenders. Periods of communication blackouts have continued in 2017 and 2018. Since the late 1980s, a variety of armed groups has been actively operating in the Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir, and there has been documented evidence of these groups committing a wide range of human rights abuses, including kidnappings and killings of civilians and sexual violence. The landscape of armed intervention by groups operating in Indian-administered Kashmir has shifted over the years. In the 1990s, around a dozen significant armed groups were operating in the region. Currently, less than half that number remain active. The main groups today include Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, Hizbul Mujahideen, and Harakat-ul-Mujahideen. They are believed to be based in Pakistan-administered Kashmir. 3 of these groups are on the Security Council, ISIL, Daesh, and Al-Qaeda and associated groups sanctions list for their activities in Indian-administered Kashmir, among other places. Civil society organizations have accused members of armed groups of numerous attacks against civilians, off-duty personnel, and army personnel on leave, and including the killing of 16 to 20 civilians between 2016 and 2018. Some of the alleged attacks include the killing of activists of mainstream political parties and threats against their leaders. The report also covers a major episode of attacks against civilians by armed groups operating in the Kashmir Valley, that is against the minority Hindus known as Kashmiri Pandits. These attacks and threats from the armed groups forced hundreds of thousands of Kashmiri Pandits to flee Kashmir and seek shelter in Jammu and other parts of India. The 2 regions of Pakistan-administered Kashmir, Azad Jammu and Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan, are supposedly autonomous, but in effect, Pakistan's Kashmir Council and Ministry of Kashmir Affairs, headed by the Pakistani Prime Minister, controls both regions. Azad Jammu and Kashmir's interim constitution makes it illegal for anyone to challenge Jammu and Kashmir's eventual accession to the state of Pakistan. This provision targets those who campaign for an independent state of Kashmir and is used to suppress political activists, civil society leaders, and journalists. According to international NGOs, in both Azad Jammu and Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan, both pro-independence political parties and activists are not allowed to participate in the political process, while political leaders who are seen to be opposing Pakistani rule have been subject to surveillance, harassment, and even imprisonment. Both Azad Jammu and Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan have legal provisions that impede the freedom of religion or belief. Anti-terrorism laws are misused to target political opposition as well as civil society activists. People protesting against large infrastructure projects and journalists have been charged under the Anti-Terrorism Act. A national NGO found that hundreds of individuals had been imprisoned under the Anti-Terrorism Act in Gilgit-Baltistan, and it was being used to target locals who have been raising issues related to the rights of the people. Finally, shelling and firing by both Pakistan and India across the line of control and working boundary is monitored by the UN Military Observer Group in India and Pakistan, UNMOGIP. Civilian populations on both sides of Kashmir have experienced killings, injuries, and loss of property. Civilians have had to relocate fearing for their lives, and normal life has been severely disrupted. While Pakistan accuses India of having committed over 2,300 violations between January 2017 and March 2018, resulting in the deaths of 74 civilians, India blames Pakistan of over 1,500 violations that has killed 35 civilians. Finally, the key recommendations, and here I'm going to quote directly from our report. OHCHR recognizes the complexity of the historical background and the political issues that has led to the current situation in Kashmir, which has been divided between India and Pakistan. People on both sides of the line of control have been detrimentally impacted and suffer from limitations or denial of a range of human rights. There remains an urgent need to address past and ongoing human rights violations and to deliver justice for all people in Kashmir who have been suffering 7 decades of conflict. Any resolution to the political situation in Kashmir should entail a commitment to ending the cycles of violence and accountability for past and current human rights violations and abuses committed by all parties, and redress for victims. Such a resolution can only be brought about by meaningful dialogue that includes the people of Kashmir. To finish, this is a summary of the key recommendations, but I really encourage you to read our report for the comprehensive and very detailed list of recommendations. To the Human Rights Council, we recommended that it consider the findings of this report, including the possible establishment of a commission of inquiry to conduct a comprehensive, independent international investigation into the allegations of human rights violations in Kashmir. To the government of Pakistan, let me start with India. To the government of India, the report recommended that India should urgently repeal the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, establish independent, impartial, and credible investigations to probe all civilian killings since July 2016 and all abuses committed by armed groups, and to provide reparations and rehabilitation to all injured individuals and to the families of those killed in the context of security operations. The report recommended that the Public Safety Act be amended to ensure its compliance with international human rights law, and all those held under administrative detention either be charged or immediately released. To the government of Pakistan, the report recommended the end of the misuse of anti-terror legislation to persecute those engaging in peaceful political and civil activities and to those who express dissent. The sections of the Azad Jammu and Kashmir interim constitution that limit the rights to freedoms of expression and opinion and peaceful assembly and association should be amended. Any political activists, journalists, and others convicted for peacefully expressing their opinions should be immediately released. The constitutions of Azad Jammu and Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan should also be amended to end the criminalization of Ahmadiyya Muslims. Thank you for your attention.
Grazie.
Thank you very much indeed. We will now open up the floor for discussion and debate. Mr. Khan.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening. I'm sure I speak for everyone in here in condemning the terrorist attacks last week in the Pulwama district. My thoughts are with the victims and their families. Mr. Chairman, I'm absolutely relieved that after months of campaigning, advocating and working across political groups, this Parliament is holding this historic exchange of views about the human rights violations in Kashmir. I am extremely grateful to you, Mr Panseri, for making this happen. I am not personally from a Kashmiri background. I am a British representative of a region with a big Indian, Pakistani and Kashmiri diaspora, but with also a moral duty to speak out due to my country's role during partition. India obtained independence. Pakistan obtained independence, but the Kashmiris were denied their future. As a result, they have suffered so much. Kashmir has long been neglected and forgotten by the international community. In fact, this Parliament has not spoken on this for 11 years. That is why many are unaware of what's happening in Kashmir. They do not know that many Kashmiris live in hell in an area often described as heaven on earth. Sexual violence, mass disappearances and pellet gun attacks on civilians are part of the daily life for innocent people. Therefore, the recent UN report, which is the first ever UN report on the human rights abuses in Kashmir, brings a ray of hope for the Kashmiris. I am delighted to welcome Madam Chung, a UN expert. I am also pleased that we have representatives of both India and Pakistan here with us, and I hope they will respond to the conclusions of the report and address its recommendations and criticisms. To be clear, there are criticisms on both sides. The human rights violations in the Pakistani administered Kashmir are of a different magnitude and a more structural nature. It is a pity that we do not have any Kashmiris on the stage to share their stories, as they would be able to give powerful testimonies to all the abuses and violations experienced over the years. Parveena Angad could tell an emotional story of her unsuccessful search for a missing 17-year-old son. The women of Kunan Pashpara could share their horrific stories about mass rapes and torture by the Indian security forces experienced 27 years ago. Farooq, one of the thousands of people that the Indian armed forces shot with pellets, could repeat his words quoted in the Amnesty International report. The pellets have turned everything black. My ambitions, my dreams, my whole life. Recently, an Indian friend told me that her father, while serving in the Indian Army, saw at first hand that fellow soldiers would stage fake encounters. These resulted in the deaths of innocent Kashmiris so they could gain promotion within the army ranks. She told me her father did not wear the uniform to witness that kind of despicable behaviour. Dear colleagues, these are just a few examples highlighting one of the biggest issues, the impunity enjoyed by the armed forces personnel who act as they please, commit terrible acts, all thanks to the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. As the UN report says, it is nearly 28 years that the law has been in force in Jammu and Kashmir. There has not been one single prosecution, let me repeat, not one single prosecution of armed forces personnel by the central government. This is unacceptable and has to end now. The EU must follow the recommendations from the UN report and urge for the establishment of a commission of inquiry into multiple human rights violations. Both sides of the line of control should allow access. Mr Chairman, let me be clear. The lack of involvement from the European External Action Service in this process so far is absolutely shocking. Kashmiri blood is not a price Europe should pay for a good trade deal with India. Mr Chairman, no doubt some of us are daunted by the challenge ahead. I will simply say that I believe peace is always possible. This continent was once devastated by wars between France and Germany, and now they're close allies. At one point, peace in Northern Ireland seemed distant and near impossible. Now it's hard to believe that the troubles happened only 20 years ago. This could be Kashmir. We can have peace and prosperity if everyone works together for this. Finally, ending conflict is not an impossible dream as long as stories that reflect both the realities of war and the possibilities of peace continue to be heard. But the first step must be to stop killing and persecuting innocent Kashmiris. In fact, we cannot get justice for the Kashmiris. If we can't get the justice for the Kashmiris, there will be no regional peace. I have one question for you, Madam Chung. What can we as the European Union do to support the report's recommendations that the UN establish a commission of inquiry? Thank you very much, Chairman.
Well, that was quite a speech there. Next colleague, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and thank you for your opening remarks. And I'm sure everybody in this room will join in condemning the atrocious terrorist attack that took place on February the 14th in Jammu and Kashmir, when 40 police personnel were murdered. I must say, first of all, Ms. Chung, I'm delighted to see you here, but I'm not sure on what basis you're here, though, what your status is at the moment, and how exactly you were invited. Was the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights approached and asked to nominate someone, or were you invited by somebody locally? I'm not quite sure. Nevertheless, you made it absolutely clear who has the responsibility for terrorism in Jammu and Kashmir, and I thank you for that. I think it is a great pity that some are trying to use this particular meeting for a sort of propaganda meeting on the subject of Kashmir, when in fact we should be looking at the whole question of sponsorship of terrorism by Pakistan in the Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir. That is really the question, because the biggest abusers of human rights are terrorists. And we have to ask ourselves, how is it that these terrorist groups can be operating in Jammu and Kashmir? As you've rightly said, they come out of the so-called Azad Kashmir, and nothing happens in Azad Kashmir because of the oppression by the Pakistani authorities without the say-so of the Pakistani authorities. It is believed that the attack on the 14th of February was carried out by Jaish-e-Mohammed, JEM, a Pakistan-based terrorist group suspected of many terror attacks in Jammu and Kashmir in recent years. This could not happen without the full complicity of Pakistan's security establishment. We call upon the government of Pakistan to put an end to terrorist activity across the line of control with India, to clamp down on terrorist groups and their activities in areas under its control, and to offer every assistance to the Indian authorities in bringing to justice the perpetrators of terrorist attacks. Pakistan has an international moral and political responsibility to stop the dangerous exploitation of the Kashmir issue for its own ends, and we've heard some of that today, to ensure there is no safe haven for terrorists and extremists on territory under its control, and to demonstrate by its actions that it wants to tread the path of dialogue and reconciliation with India. And this is a message that the diaspora needs to take home. Mr. Chairman, taking the reports even on its own terms, it is fulsome in its condemnation of the human rights situation in that part of Kashmir that's currently under Pakistani control. And instead of people thinking this report somehow or other is completely an attack on India, actually it is very clear some of the problems that are there. But I would suggest the bigger problem is the sponsorship of terrorism. If that awful affliction was removed, then of course everyone in this region could live in peace and harmony. And let us remember that India is a free, prosperous democracy where its 172 million Muslims, the third largest Muslim population in the world, are free to exercise their religion and their wider civil rights in a way which those sitting over in so-called Azad Kashmir cannot do. Thank you so much.
Grazie.
Thanks very much. Now, just two small points, three rather. Firstly, refrain from passing free comment here on what the MEPs are saying, whether you disagree or not, whilst they are speaking. Secondly, we've only got half an hour, then we have to call it a day, since we've all been working very hard indeed, so we'll have to leave at 18:30. We can proceed after 18:30, but only in English. Although I see there are a lot of people from Britain in the room. Third point, Mr. Van Orden. We sent an invitation out to the office of the High Commissioner, and the High Commissioner designated Ms. Chung to attend. So she does not need to explain why she's here. David Martin.
Thank you, Chair. Firstly, I'd like to join with Ms. Chung and the other previous speakers in condemning the terrorist attack and sending sympathy to the families of those involved. I warmly welcome the report that we have just had introduced to us. It's a bold attempt to shine a light on a distressing situation which we know that India would rather the world didn't hear about, and has made extensive efforts to ensure that the world cannot report on what goes on in Indian-controlled Kashmir. I find this extremely sad because, like Mr. Van Orden, I think there is much to admire about India. I think it's the largest democracy in the world. But if I was the Indian government, I would be hanging my head in collective shame about the way that we've behaved in Kashmir. There is no pride for India in their behaviour in that part. In that part of the world. I'm glad that there has not been so far an attempt to dismiss the content of this report, because difficult as it was to obtain the information that the OHCHR have obtained, it backs up what we've been hearing, sadly, in this committee and over a long number of years from organisations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch and others. So I have no doubt that the report is accurate. Mr. Van Orden is absolutely right. Terrorism from either side is unacceptable. I still believe, although I think they are making efforts, I still believe Pakistan could do significantly more to hinder the terrorists, but to put the blame even on terrorists for the behaviour of the controlling forces is unacceptable. It is the duty of those in command and in control to behave as impeccably as they possibly can. They are the people with the authority, they are the people with the machinery of government behind them, and they should be held accountable. And it's a disgrace that the central government in India, as we've heard from at least two speakers, has never, ever prosecuted a single soldier, despite compelling evidence of human rights abuses. So I don't want to say much more, because I think my colleague, Mr. Khan, has made the position extremely clear, and I think Ms. Chung's report was extremely clear. But there is no gain here in blaming one side or the other, or trying to excuse one side or the other. We need to find a humanitarian solution to a humanitarian crisis, and we don't need to enter into, and so far I'm glad again to say that other than tangentially, no one has. This is not about who controls Kashmir. This is not about the history of Kashmir. This is about the rights of individuals living in that country to be treated with respect.
Grazie.
Thank you, David. Solé.
Thank you, President. We are here today to approach the long-standing Kashmir conflict from a human rights perspective on the basis of the UN Human Rights Report, a report that focuses on developments in the Indian-administered Kashmir from June 2016 to April 2018, but also raises human rights concerns in Azad Jammu and Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan provinces administered by Pakistan. This report seems to me to be a balanced and factual report which contains very clear findings as well as recommendations to both governments in order to protect human rights in Kashmir. After 7 decades of a very complex and violent conflict, the people of Kashmir, in whatever side of the line of control, from whatever confession and identity, deserve justice and a peaceful solution. Violence is never a valid means to resolve political and territorial disputes. All forms of violence must be condemned. And therefore, I want also to take the opportunity to condemn the terrorist attack on February the 14th. At the same time, I urge armed forces to exercise maximum restraint and abide by international standards when dealing with acts of protest or dissent. Any political solution must bring about the end of the vicious circle of violence, as well as accountability for past and current violations and abuses committed by all parties. The solution can only be reached through dialogue and by involving the people of Kashmir, who have the right to decide on their own future. Systematic violations of fundamental human rights and impunity for such violations must be brought to an end. Access to justice and remedy must be granted. Indian security forces shouldn't have immunity against prosecution for human rights violations or extrajudicial killings. On the Pakistan administered side, the misuse of anti-terror laws to prosecute those engaging in peaceful political and civil activities must stop. And in any event, international law obligations must be respected. Finally, in the quest for truth and justice, I support the request to conduct a comprehensive, independent international investigation into allegations of human rights violations and abuses in Kashmir. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Chairman. First of all, I'm just really disappointed that my very dear colleague, Geoffrey Van Orden, could not have been more constructive in his remarks. But on saying that, this UN report on human rights violations in Kashmir is pretty disturbing reading. And if it's a true and accurate picture of what is happening, and there is no reason not to believe in the impartiality of the UN, then the current situation in Kashmir cannot be allowed to continue. Recent tragic events, such as the loss of life of 40 paramilitary police last week, and again the news this morning of a number of atrocities, further highlights the need for urgent action, not just in the interests of the Kashmiri people, but for their neighbours. And it is the people of Kashmir themselves who must be placed front and centre in any negotiations to address their interests. For far too long, their right to self-determination has been ignored. Leaving aside for 1 minute the catalogue of human rights violations as documented in the report, it is a contravention of the Kashmiri people's human rights that for the last 70 years they have been denied the right to self-determination. It is time for a political solution. And this is in the interests of the region as a whole. Young and growing populations requiring education and fruitful employment. We all know economic prosperity can only truly be achieved by peaceful coexistence when everyone's human rights are given equal weight. And it is evident that the people of Kashmir have not been well served by the political arrangements of the past 70 years, but this can change. I think about my own country, the United Kingdom, and how a situation which seemed intractable was eventually resolved when a consensus between the Republic of Ireland, Northern Ireland and the United Kingdom was reached, and which led to the Good Friday Agreement. I fully support the UN report and its recommendations, including the Armed Forces Special Powers Act of 1990, which should be repealed. But I do not want to use this speaking time to castigate either India or Pakistan. It is time for both to work together with Kashmir to put differences behind them and find a lasting peace for the people of Kashmir. Indeed, it is in the interests of the whole region.
Grazie.
Thanks.
Ja, danke, Herr Vorsitzender. Ich rede mal im
I'll speak my mother tongue. Now, this Parliament prepared a detailed report on Kashmir. I had the honour of being the rapporteur for my political group, and back then in 2007 I was somewhat famous. It's very depressing to note the atmosphere on the ground out there. There's a high military presence, and I've never seen such a presence elsewhere in the world. It's unprecedented. This paradise has really suffered a downfall. It was a flourishing paradise, but it has waned, and it's very sad for the people who live there. Back then, we issued 78 recommendations. I've got the report in front of me. I flicked through it on the way here. Ms. Chang, what you said tallies perfectly with what we said in 2007. We've picked up on the same things. Unfortunately, 12 years have elapsed without anything positive happening. That's very saddening. I'm speaking German because I've got the text in German. I'd like to quote a few things. We regret the proven human rights infringements by the Indian armed forces, the murders and rapes. We note with regret that the International Human Rights Commission is not empowered to investigate these infringements. You said precisely the same thing. On the flip side, we said that we are aware that without terminating terrorism, there can be no real headway made to improve the economic situation of the populace. And we said we firmly support the recommendations issued to Pakistan by the International Crisis Group to take decisive measures to disarm the militant groups, to close the terrorist training camps and prevent the recruitment of terrorists in the region. That's the vicious circle which keeps cropping up. Nothing has happened in 12 years. I shall keep it brief. Back then, I said the same as I say today, and Mr. Khan preempted me on this. I live on the border between France and Germany. We've conducted 3 wars about this stupid border, and now we are the best of buddies. I don't understand why there can't be some goodwill generated in India and Pakistan. After all this suffering and all these wars, can positive measures not be enacted to foster dialogue, to end this senseless conflict? This worked in Europe, and it ought to be feasible to do likewise in this part of Asia. So we all need to knock heads and do our level best to set things in motion. Bashir.
Chairman Panzeri, I welcome the reading of the report by the UN expert Ms. Chung. For decades, 2 common misconceptions have dogged the dispute over Jammu and Kashmir. First is that it is so protracted, so deeply entrenched that it can never be resolved. The second is that it is purely a bilateral matter, a private row between India and Pakistan, not a matter of concern for the rest of the world. Over the last years, some of the world's most reputed NGOs, such as Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, as well as worldwide media like the BBC and the New York Times, have reported on the dead-eye epidemic in the Indian-administered Jammu and Kashmir, where people are being systematically tortured, maimed and murdered. But all that was before the first ever report on the human rights situation in Kashmir that was released last June by the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. This report documents the facts, and nothing but the facts on both sides of the line of control. On the one hand, this report confirms impunity for grave human rights violations and lack of access to justice in Jammu and Kashmir. On the other hand, this report also noted human rights abuses in Pakistani Kashmir, though of a different calibre or magnitude to those in Indian Kashmir. Obviously, firing pellet guns against thousands of innocent civilians, including children, with impunity in Indian-administered Kashmir is of a different caliber to restriction on the rights of freedom of expression and opinion, peaceful assembly and association on the other side of the line of control. As a member of the DRA subcommittee, it is my duty to care for every human being, irrespective of colour, nationality or religion. And this applies to the whole of Asia, including India and Pakistan, and including Kashmir. As an ECR member, I support international efforts to defuse tensions, encourage peace and stability, and address issues related to human rights abuses and territorial claims. I can only therefore welcome this first ever UN human rights report on Kashmir that calls for international inquiry and congratulate the DWA chair and the DWA as a whole for finally including this matter on the agenda. May I therefore humbly urge both countries to grant immediate unconditional access to the UN without any exceptions of reciprocity from the other side as a first step to peace and stability. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you very much. Barbara Lochbihler will now assume the chair.
Danke, Herr Vorsitzender. Das nächste Wort hat die Frau Ward.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Ward has the floor.
Ich darf Sie doch alle noch mal daran.
And could I remind everybody that we've only got 15 minutes left, and please don't clap, don't applaud in this house. This is not our convention, and by not applauding we'll also save time.
Thank you very much, Chair. Well, first of all, I want to pay tribute to my colleague Wajid Khan, who has been in this Parliament less than 2 years, and in that short time seems to have learnt a lot more about how the Parliament operates than Mr. Orden, who appears to have been here since 1999 and doesn't seem to understand how a hearing is organised, how an exchange of views happens, how experts are suggested by different members. So I'm really pleased, Wajid, that you came here and you took this seriously and you've done something about it. We can all do something about it, and those of us who care about human rights in this House can do something about human rights, even if we are not on the subcommittee for human rights. And from my perspective, I think that all politicians should care about human rights fundamentally as a first principle. Otherwise, I don't think we're doing our job properly. And I'm not on the Trade Committee, but I was somebody who voted in this House in October to support the UN binding charter to uphold human rights in trade agreements. And I would say that this is something that the EU institutions are going to take seriously, that trade cannot be continued and trade agreements should not be signed if human rights are going to be abused. And I'm really proud that the EU is doing that, but actually my country back home and my government in the UK is not interested in human rights. So this is the place where human rights can be upheld best, the European Parliament. I'd like to speak about some of the people who don't have a voice. I work on women's rights, I work on children's rights, and women's rights, women victims of violence, both physical violence but also psychological violence in Kashmir, is really, really serious. And if you go to Kashmir, if you meet the people who are the victims of the violence, then you see the real impact on them. And this includes the half-widows that I met in Mufazzarabad, who do not know where their husbands are. They are the victims of this situation. They don't have a voice, and they sit there and they are waiting to find out whether or not their husbands are still alive. They do not know where they are. There is also the practice of braid chopping. So Indian military soldiers have been subjecting Kashmiri women to a very undignified process, a very undignified practice, which is to chop their braids. And this is all about demeaning the women. These things are happening. And if you go and meet with the women, you will see it and hear it for yourself. And I think that's important, that we speak about things because we make the journey, we make the effort, we find out. And these things, your report is really, really important, Madam, but it still doesn't tell the whole story. And the whole story is because many people have not got a voice. Women and children become the victims, the first victims, the most persistent victims of all conflict in the world. So I want to say I will always speak up for those victims, and we need more to have more people speaking up about those innocent victims who are victims of violence.
Danke, Frau Ward. Jetzt habe ich noch auf der Liste.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Ward. I've got Mr. Tannock, Ms. Simon, and Ms. Griffin on my list.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Well, there's a sense of déjà vu to me being in this committee today. I've been a member of this committee for 18 years, and indeed I was the EPP shadow rapporteur to what was the Nicholson report in 2007 on Kashmir. And my colleague Jo Leinen has pointed out that many of the recommendations which we all signed up to are still extant and valid today. And sadly, more than a decade has gone by, and the longest-standing bilateral territorial dispute mandated by a UN resolution for 70-odd years is still not yet settled, in spite of words from both governments periodically of wishing to find a way forward on this very protracted issue. And I certainly don't dismiss the findings of this UN report. And indeed, the successor to Mr. Zaid, the new Human Rights Commissioner, the former President of Chile, Michelle Bachelet, has made it clear in her inaugural address that these issues must be addressed, and the contents of this report must also be looked at in detail, and both sides must open up their territories to investigation. Certainly, I too would like to add my voice to those who have condemned the atrocity last Thursday by a self-confessed Jaish-e-Mohammed terrorist. All the intelligence I've ever received over the years from numerous sources have always confirmed to me that the ISI of Pakistan has supported Jaish-e-Mohammed. So I would call on the Prime Minister of Pakistan and the authorities to arrest its leader, Masood Azhar, as a demonstration of the goodwill in Pakistan to actually crack down on this terrorist group. Because clearly tensions are very, very high. Pakistan and India are nuclear powers. Mr. Modi is threatening retaliation. Imran Khan has said that that will result in unforeseen terrible consequences. We do not wish to see a war break out between these two democratic Commonwealth powers in South Asia. That would be a tragedy. But Pakistan must go further in cracking down on the terrorist groups which seem to have impunity in their Pakistani-administered part of Kashmir. I don't remotely defend impunity for human rights abuses by anybody, including those allegations made against the Indian Army. These must all be investigated. I, like Jo Leinen 12 years ago, I had hoped at that time, and this was well before Brexit was even considered, that the EU model of the single market, of a degree of political union and cooperation supranationally, particularly in economic matters, might have been the solution. And one of the things that I regret most is that SAFTA and SAARC have actually never got off the ground, partly because I'm afraid Pakistan always had its so-called positive list, whereby it only allowed certain products to be traded. One of the things we both witnessed when we went to Srinagar was the degree of poverty and deprivation in this beautiful princely state, which would have had such a great future had they not been subject to these disputes regarding the sovereignty and the jurisdiction and the commercial development and the economy of the territory. So I'd hope that SAFTA and SAARC would have meant eventually that the line of control would have become just a line on the map, and that people could have travelled freely across the borders. Unfortunately, none of that came to pass, and now we are actually going back to a global situation whereby everybody wants to put up barriers, walls, and Brexit, of course, is just an example of the response by the United Kingdom. So it's quite depressing, 12 years on from our report, Joe, to see that nothing much has changed. The dispute is exactly the same. The same terrorist organisation is responsible for the same terrible atrocity against Indian security forces. And I feel like we're in a kind of time warp, and there just has to be some imaginative thinking. Heads need to be knocked together. And whether the European Union, the European Parliament can have a role, I don't know. At the time, I regarded it purely as a bilateral dispute, that we had no role to play, but we did have our report, and it was UN mediated. But the UN haven't been able to do much. I don't know what the solution is, but clearly, I sincerely hope that in 10 years' time, we will not be having the same debate again.
Danke, Herr Tannock. Jetzt heißt
Thank you, Mr. Tannock. Mr. Simon.
Thank you. I welcome the report and its conclusions, and I find it deeply disappointing that literally one or two colleagues have responded to this report by castigating one side or exonerating another side. That is unworthy of this institution, and it is unworthy of the seriousness of the violations and abuses that we're talking about. I speak on behalf of the hundreds of thousands, the several hundreds of thousands of people of Kashmiri origin who live in my constituency in the West Midlands, and I speak from a unique and great democratic institution that represents people across boundaries in a way that's never been done in the world before. And the message, which is what we should be focused on here, is a very simple one. It's that the people of Kashmiri origin, who are my constituency, who are my constituents in the English West Midlands, they have a right to walk the streets free of disappearance, murder, rape, abuse, and they take that for granted, as they should, because it is a fundamental human right that should apply to all people in all societies, everywhere, all the time. And the same rights should apply to their cousins and their uncles and aunties, their parents and grandparents in Kashmir. The right simply to live freely in peace, not to be murdered, not to be stolen, not to be raped, not to be tortured. And this great democratic institution, along with the United Nations, another great democratic institution, now says for the first time, clearly and unequivocally, there is a line in the sand, and it has got to stop, and it has got to start stopping now. And that's why simply to say, oh, don't blame India, is a pretty shameful response.
so. Danke, Herr Simon. Jetzt
Thank you, Mr. Simon. Mrs. Griffin now, and then I'll give the floor to Mrs. Chung. But in 1 minute's time, we will continue only in English. Mrs. Griffin.
Thank you, Chair. Firstly, I would like to say thank you very much to Ms. Chung. I think your recommendations are very clear, and as David said in his contribution, it actually crystallises what we have known for many years. I'd like to pay tribute to Wajid and Antonio, and because, like Sean, I represent a region with hundreds of thousands of Kashmiri in the diaspora. 11 years for us to come to an exchange of views. I'm delighted that I am actually joined in this House by an MP and a councillor from my region, Afsar Khan and Yasmin Dar, because we are trying to work in my region at every level of politics to find a solution to something that was brought to me a decade ago in Oldham Town Hall at 7 o'clock on a Friday night by women and children showing pictures and films of what was happening to their relatives in Kashmir. Torture, enforced disappearance, use of pellet guns, violation of rights to health, rights to education, sexual violence, and, as people have said again, on both sides, restriction of rights to freedom of expression, land rights, but of a different order. I completely agree with Sheena. I have the privilege of working on the peace process in Ireland and Northern Ireland. We have to find, after so many years, a peaceful solution via politics and a meaningful dialogue that includes, crucially, all the people of Kashmir.
So, thank you. It's really very unlikely, also on another subject, that we clap here. It's very different than the British Parliament, I think. So before I give the floor to Madam Chang, let me also say when we had the enlarged bureau in Doha, we were very clear that we will host this meeting because we would like to focus on human rights. And I think having the first UN report on this issue, which was published in June 2018, helped enormously to set the tone, so that we not just discussed, and most of you also stick to this rule, that we focused on human rights and not blaming the one or the other country and leave this behind us. I also think that one of the recommendations you said, Madam Cham, at the beginning, in your report, you recommend to the Human Rights Council to establish an independent inquiry commission, will be followed up in Geneva. I'm not sure if this will be done in March, but we just had started this morning's session also, having received the permission that the European Parliament also will send a delegation to the Human Rights Council session, and for sure we will also ask these questions, how far this recommendation has come. Now, as I said, we will not have interpretation. I understand most of us do understand English, so if you could briefly perhaps sum up and answer the questions. Thank you.
Thank you again for the opportunity to respond to the questions. I actually didn't pick up very many questions, but I do appreciate the support and the appreciation, I think, that was expressed for the report that the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights produced on this very complex and very long-standing situation in Kashmir. What I would like to say is that this is only the first report on the human rights situation, and it was limited in scope. Madam Ward mentioned that the victims' voices are missing from our report, and I would actually agree with her. I think this is a valid criticism, and we regret very much that we were not able to cover directly the human stories of suffering. But this is the reason why our recommendation was made to the Human Rights Council that it should consider establishing an independent investigation, because we don't have the means to do this, especially without the access. We can't appropriately cover the victims' voices. And I think Mr. Khan's question about what the European Parliament can do to support OHCHR in this recommendation that was made for the establishment of an independent investigation. Look, the Human Rights Council is a UN member state body. And so the Human Rights Council is governments. It's the states that can establish this investigation, a commission of inquiry, or whatever you might call it. And that has to be done in the Human Rights Council through a resolution. And so I think in terms of what you can do would be advocacy to support the states to take this matter up in the Human Rights Council. So I think those were the only remaining questions for me. And so I would like to, again, thank the subcommittee for the invitation and the opportunity to share the report. I urge you very strongly to read the report. It is 49 pages, but I think it still is only a summary of the situation of human rights in Kashmir, both on the Pakistan side and the Indian side. I thank you, and
we thank you for the presentation, and then I close the meeting. So now herewith I close the meeting, and I think we have enough recommendations, and as I said, some of us will also follow the Human Rights Council session. Thank you. So, good survived. But you know, this is all. Can you imagine? After Brexit,